in 1983, I quit a job in the middle of the year and I started going to the beach, to Hollywood Beach, and was basically writing. And I was working on a book, and every morning I would jog and I would see this man who was doing exactly the same thing. He was set up with his books and his papers. We would jog by each other, wave. We did not talk for a while. And then one day he stopped and talked to me. So my friend Tom had just left the priesthood, and he had been an on-air reporter when the Kennedys and Martin Luther King got shot. His whole idealism just kind of shattered, and he went into the priesthood. So he left the priesthood. He was working on a documentary on the moral majority, and I was writing this novel. And I won't go into all the details with Tom, but Tom left. He was only there for a month, but we started having this really intense conversation. And he left and he started doing temp work. And he ended up in New York and got a job working for a man who was the president of the Anne Frank Center at the time. And so this was in early 85. And this man was working also on a play. It was an off-Broadway play. It was an operetta called Yours, Anne, about the Diary of Anne Frank. And my friend Tom's job was to help with the PR. And this man asked Tom at some point after working with him if he would be willing to become the director of the Anne Frank Center in New York. And so here's Tom, this Catholic boy who suddenly went into a whole new world. One of the things that happened when he started his job was that someone had found the Anne Frank family photograph album in a chest of drawers in Germany. And they had sent it to the Anne Frank Center in Amsterdam. And when they sent it, the center in Amsterdam created an exhibition called Anne Frank in the World, 1929 to 1945. It was an exhibition that centered on the Anne Frank family photograph album. So there were pictures of Anne at the beach and, you know, doing the things the kids do. And then they put that in the middle and told the story of the Holocaust in 800 photographs, black and white photographs. And they created a wonderful exhibition. So they sent it to the United States, and the Anne Frank Center in New York was responsible for sending it across the country. So my friend Tom called me. He knew I wasn't working. He knew I was a journal, you know, someone who kept journals. He knew that Anne Frank spoke to my soul. And he also knew that I really needed a job, and said, how would you like to be the first city to bring it, you know, bring it to Miami and do whatever you want. You can make this as big as you want as a volunteer. And at that point, you know, I hadn't been working for 2.5 years, and my husband very kindly said, you have to do this. He was really generous because we really needed me to be working. So I brought the exhibit to Miami, to the main library in downtown Miami had just opened, and we had the exhibition there. It was a six weeks. My goal was to have 50,000 people and an editorial in the Miami Herald. So we got the editorial in the Herald, and we had well more than 60,000 people. And during that time, I did a lot of programming. So I spoke to about 100 groups, but I also had some student groups. And one of the things I did was a student symposium. And at this symposium, I had met with the cast from North Miami Beach that was putting on the play, The Diary of Anne Frank. And I brought a Holocaust survivor who had been in hiding down the street from Anne Frank, and had the kids who were the characters in the play speak to this man as though they were actually the real characters, asking him questions like, how did you live with people in your home and not fight? And what, you know, how did you get your food? They were asking personal questions, and he was speaking from his experience. So I had 2 students from every high school in Dade County come to the symposium, and the entire cast and crew. And all I had for everyone was just their names, their first names. That was the only thing, the only identification. So no one, aside from the kids that came from the same schools, knew each other. And we did a journaling session, and I had 2 women from the Holocaust Center that was at the time on North Campus of FIU. And after lunch, I had Peter stand up, and Peter started, he did a line from one of the acts, and then one by one, the characters stood up and did this. It was really mind-boggling. And the women from the center, after the exhibit was over, called me up and said they wanted to do some student programming. And they asked me if I would be willing to come as a volunteer and help them set something up. I was there for maybe a week volunteering when the secretary quit, and they said, one of the assistant director called and said, would you be willing to work as a secretary? And I said, I will, for 3 months, because then I really needed a job. I said, but after 3 months, if I'm not in education, I'm out of there. They had hired someone who had her PhD in Holocaust studies who was coming. So this was in March, and she was coming in August. And when she came, she was she was a scholar. She was an academician, but she was absolutely not an administrator. She was a disaster. So she lasted a very short time. They fired her, and Abe Fischler at the time was the president of our center, as well as Nova Southeastern. And he took me to brunch, and he grilled me for 3 hours. And he said, okay, you can have the position of director of educational outreach. And so I was there for 26 years. And the interesting thing is, my mother, early on, when Tom and I first became friends, my mother was only afraid Tom was trying to convert me. Meanwhile, he brought me to this job that was the most meaningful thing I could have ever done in my life. So you never know who you meet, and you never know where it's going to take you.